So you want to own a Roman gladiator school. You picture marble colonnades ringing a sand-covered practice yard, the clang of wooden ruddy swords at dawn, and a stable of fighters whose names are chanted by 80,000 people in the Colosseum. You picture the applause becoming your income, every drop of blood in the arena turning into another handful of coin in your strongbox. Here's the number that breaks that picture. A single well-trained gladiator, a myrmillo or a thrax, with a few arena victories to his name, could cost as much as 15,000 sesterces to acquire and train. A Roman legionary earned around 900 sesterces a year. You are looking at almost 17 years of a soldier's total wages tied up in one man who might die in his next fight. So why would a Roman Senate, sitting in the year 177 AD, feel the need to pass a law capping how much these men could cost? Why did the empire's most notoriously bloody entertainment industry get regulated like a modern commodities market? And why did the men who owned these schools, the lanistae, spend more energy keeping their gladiators alive than anyone in the audience ever assumed? This isn't what the poets sang about. This is what a surviving bronze inscription, dug up in the Spanish town of Italica, and now known as the Senatus Consultum de Sumptibus Ludorum Gladiatorium Minuendis, the Senate's decree on reducing the costs of gladiatorial games, actually says. And it says the gladiator business had gotten so expensive, so financially reckless, that Rome itself had to step in and pull the brakes. A gladiator school, a ludus, was not a stadium, and it was not a slaughterhouse. It was a training academy, a boarding house, a medical facility, and a talent agency, all inside one walled compound. At the center was a sand yard, the same surface as the arena, so gladiators trained on the exact footing they'd fight on. Around it, barrack cells, barely large enough for a cot, often literally chained shut at night, because the property inside them was worth more than most furniture in Rome. A kitchen serving a heavy, deliberately fattening barley and bean diet, so fighters carried a layer of fat that made surface wounds look dramatic without cutting into anything vital. An infirmary, staffed by a doctor, because dead capital earns nothing, and an armory, storing gear that belonged to the school, not the fighter. Running it all was the lanistae, part manager, part owner, part talent scout, universally looked down on by the Roman elite as a merchant of human flesh, even while every one of those elite citizens attended his shows. Beneath the lanistae sat a staff of doctores, specialist trainers, one per weapon style. A doctor training myrmillones, heavy shield and sword fighters, never touched a retiarius, the net and trident men who fought half-armored for speed. Each style was its own discipline, its own economy of skill, and mixing them wasted training time the lanistae was paying for by the day. None of this came cheap, and none of it ran on hope. It ran on contracts, which brings us to where the money actually started. Opening a ludus meant solving one brutal equation before a single fight was ever booked. How do you acquire fighting men, and how do you pay for men who might be worthless by next month? There were 3 supply lines, and they were not equal in cost or in risk. The cheapest source was the damnati, men condemned to the arena by Roman courts, criminals and captured enemies sentenced to fight or die, sometimes literally damnatia gladium, condemned to the sword with no expectation of survival at all. These men cost almost nothing to acquire because the state was simply disposing of them, but they were also the worst investment a lanistae could make, untrained, unmotivated, and statistically dead within their first appearance. Buying only damnati was the ancient equivalent of buying a fleet of cars you already know will be totaled. The second source was purchased slaves, bought at market specifically for gladiatorial training, a longer-term investment, cheaper than a finished gladiator, but requiring 1 to 3 years of training before they were worth putting in front of a paying crowd. The third, and strangest to a modern ear, was the octorati, free Roman citizens who voluntarily signed themselves into gladiatorial service. They swore the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, a legal oath to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed with iron if their master commanded it. In exchange, they received a signing fee, a share of prize money, and, crucially, they arrived already motivated, sometimes already trained in swordsmanship for military service or personal desperation. A graffito surviving on a wall in Pompeii records exactly this kind of man. Marcus Attilius, a freeborn volunteer in his very first bout, listed as defeating Hilarus, a veteran gladiator with 12 prior victories. Rome's crowds loved an underdog story as much as any modern audience, and Attilius's win was carved into a wall specifically because it was so improbable. Financing this stable of assets rarely came from one man's coin purse. Lanistae borrowed against future contracts, partnered with wealthy backers who wanted quiet ownership stakes without the social shame of the lanista title attached to their own name, and increasingly, later in the empire, operated schools that were directly financed and owned by the state or by provincial governors, because the return on a good gladiator wasn't one payday. It was a rental income stream that could run for years. A ludus ran on a punishing daily schedule, and every part of it was designed around one goal: protecting an expensive asset long enough to profit from it repeatedly. Mornings began with conditioning, running, weighted drills, feints practiced against a palace, a wooden post driven into the ground, used to build muscle memory before ever crossing blades with another human being. Only after months of this did a gladiator train with a partner, and even then with wooden practice weapons, the rudis, to limit injuries during training itself. An injured gladiator earned nothing while he healed, and healing cost money in food and medical care he wasn't generating revenue to cover. Diet, medical care, and gear were centrally managed because a lanista who let his men self-manage their own equipment or nutrition was a lanista who'd watch his investment decay. Physicians attached to major ludi, the famous ludus magnus beside the Colosseum among them, treated wounds with techniques advanced enough that Galen, the most influential physician of the ancient world, spent part of his early career as doctor to the gladiators of Pergamon, specifically because arena wounds taught him more about human anatomy than almost anything else available at the time. And every gladiator, regardless of style, was inventoried, insured against loss in the sense that his value was formally recorded and scheduled, because the actual product the lanista was selling wasn't a fight. It was an appointment. Here is the twist almost nobody expects. The money was never really in the killing. It was in the renting. You'd assume a lanista profited when his gladiator won and possibly died gloriously, feeding the crowd's appetite for spectacle. He did not. A dead gladiator was a liquidated asset, and Roman law, reinforced explicitly in that 177 AD senatorial decree from Italica, required the editor, the sponsor paying for the games, to compensate the lanista at a rate far above the gladiator's contracted appearance fee if the man died in the arena. A living gladiator who fought and survived might earn his owner a modest fee. A dead one triggered what was essentially a forced buyout at a price far higher than a single show's takings could offset. The real business then was leasing. A lanista didn't sell gladiators. He loaned them under a legal arrangement called locatio conductio operarum, a labor lease contract, to an editor staging games for a festival, a funeral, or a political campaign. The lanista got a fee per fighter per appearance. If the gladiator survived, that same asset could be leased again next month, next year, for a decade. Estimates drawn from surviving epitaphs suggest most professional gladiators fought only 2 to 3 times a year, and the overwhelming majority of individual bouts ended not in death, but in missio, a reprieve granted by the editor, often at the crowd's urging. When a defeated fighter showed courage, but was clearly beaten, you weren't running a house of executions. You were running a leasing company for extremely dangerous, extremely expensive, occasionally lethal human capital. And the entire pricing structure of the Roman arena existed specifically to punish anyone who wasted that capital carelessly. The lanistae looked on paper like the man in charge. In practice, he answered to everyone. The editor who leased his fighters held enormous leverage. A wealthy magistrate or emperor staging games to buy public favor could dictate terms, demand star fighters by name, and threaten to take his business to a rival school if refused. Local magistrates and later imperial officials regulated ticket prices, festival calendars, and, after 177 AD, the maximum price a lanistae could charge for gladiators of each skill tier, sorted into price classes from the cheapest gregarii, ordinary rank-and-file fighters, up to elite champions, whose fees the Senate explicitly tried to cap after costs spiraled so far that provincial towns were bankrupting themselves competing to host bigger, bloodier games. And above the editors sat the emperor himself. By the 2nd century, the largest and most prestigious ludus in Rome, the ludus magnus, was imperial property, not private enterprise. Emperors like Trajan, celebrating his Dacian conquests, could stage games involving an estimated 10,000 gladiators over more than 100 days, a scale no private lanistae could ever finance or supply alone. Independent lanistae increasingly survived by servicing the smaller provincial festivals the imperial machine didn't bother with, the leftovers of an entertainment economy the state had effectively nationalized at its top tier. Owning a ludus, then, meant owning very little real independence. You owned the risk. Rome owned the terms. Every asset in this business could be destroyed by forces entirely outside your control. Fire was constant. Barracks packed with straw bedding, oil lamps, and men chained in place at night made a ludus one-dropped lamp away from catastrophe, with no way for the trapped occupants to escape. Disease spread easily through crowded barracks, feeding dozens of men from shared kitchens. An outbreak could gut a school's entire roster in weeks, with no insurance and no replacement fighters available on short notice. Political risk was just as sharp. An emperor's shifting favor could redirect all the prestige contracts toward the imperial ludus overnight. A magistrate could cancel a festival's games entirely over a public health scare or a political crisis, leaving a lanistae holding fully trained fighters with no lessee and no income. And then there was the risk of the men themselves. A ludus was, by design, a facility packed with people trained in armed combat who had every reason to resent their captivity. In 73 BC, at a ludus in Capua, owned by Gnaeus Lentulus Batiatus, a group of gladiators, among them a Thracian named Spartacus, broke out using kitchen knives and skewers, seized a wagon of actual weapons, and triggered a revolt that grew into an army of tens of thousands and took Rome's legions 2 years to finally crush. It remains the single most catastrophic operational failure in the history of the industry, a business model built entirely on controlling armed, desperate men, undone at the one ludus that failed to control them. Not every ruin came from fire or rebellion. Most came from simple bad math, a lanistae who overpaid for a starfighter, only to see him killed in his first major bout, could lose years of projected rental income in a single afternoon, and the compensation Roman law required from the editor rarely covered the true replacement cost of retraining an equivalent talent from scratch. Provincial towns bankrupted their own treasuries, trying to outbid rivals for headline fighters to prestige their local festivals, a competitive spiral serious enough that the Italica decree of 177 AD explicitly blamed immoderate expense for driving towns into financial ruin and forced fixed price ceilings onto the entire gladiatorial market. tier by tier, to stop it. Individual tragedy is written into the surviving tombstones themselves. One inscription memorializes Flamma, a Syrian-born gladiator who fought roughly 34 recorded bouts, won the wooden rudis, the symbolic sword, marking an offer of freedom, 4 separate times, and refused it every time, choosing to remain a gladiator until his death at around 30 years old. Whether that was loyalty, addiction to the only status he'd ever known, or a lanistae's continued financial hold over him, the stone doesn't say. It only records the number: 34 fights, 4 refused freedoms, 1 final loss. The single lanistae running one modest provincial ludus rarely became genuinely wealthy. His income was real but volatile, dependent on festival calendars he didn't control, fighters whose value could vanish in one afternoon, and a legal system that capped his upside while leaving him fully exposed to loss. The people who actually built fortunes from this industry were the ones who owned the network, not the individual asset. That meant the state itself, which by the height of the empire had absorbed the largest, most prestigious training operations directly into imperial property, collecting the prestige and much of the profit of the entire top tier of the industry, while provincial lanistae fought over what was left. It meant the editores, wealthy men who used games as political currency, buying public loyalty with a lanistae's fighters and a lanistae's financial risk, while keeping the popularity for themselves. And occasionally, it meant a rare gladiator who survived long enough, won often enough, and negotiated well enough to buy his own freedom, and, in a handful of documented cases, become a trainer or lanistae himself, converting the one asset he actually owned, his own survival, into ownership of someone else's. You didn't build an arena of death. You built a leasing company for human survival, priced by the sesterces, regulated by the Senate, and owned in the end, not by the men who trained the fighters, but by whoever controlled the calendar of days on which the crowd was allowed to decide who got to keep breathing.